My name is Eleanor, and I'm in my late 30s now. I'm a wife, at least I was at the time of this story, a working professional, and for most of my adult life, the person everyone described as steady, not loud, not dramatic, the one who keeps things moving quietly in the background. People tend to underestimate women like me, because I don't raise my voice, because I don't announce my pain the moment it happens, because I learned early that being composed makes others comfortable, even when it costs me something. To most people, I came across as agreeable, resilient, and endlessly understanding. The kind of woman who would be fine, no matter what was asked of her. This story isn't about a single argument or one explosive betrayal. It's about a choice, a very small-looking choice, made during a moment of grief that revealed something permanent about the man I married, and about myself. My husband refused to attend my father's funeral. There's no twist there, no exaggeration. What matters is not the refusal itself, but what it clarified. Because support is remembered most in grief, long after apologies fade, long after explanations lose their edge. What you're about to hear is not a revenge story. There are no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no moment where someone gets what they deserve in a cinematic way. This is a documentary-style account of how quiet dominance forms, not through force, but through memory, restraint, and irreversible clarity. I'll walk you through who I was in that marriage, how I slowly became invisible without realizing it, and how one moment of loss reshaped my internal compass. You'll hear about patience that wasn't weakness, silence that wasn't fear, and preparation that didn't look like anything at all until it was finished. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, because stories like this often get reduced to headlines or moral judgments. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why did you stay quiet? Those questions assume that clarity arrives all at once. It doesn't. It accumulates. This is not about punishing someone. It's about understanding the cost of being unsupported at the exact moment you needed someone to stand beside you, and how remembering that cost can change every decision you make afterward. I don't ask for your sympathy, only your attention, and maybe your reflection. Have you ever noticed how clearly you remember who showed up for you when you were grieving? Before anything broke, before grief rearranged my spine from the inside, I need you to understand who I was to the people around me, especially to my husband. I was the reliable one, not the favorite, not the one people worried about. I was the person others leaned on without asking whether I was already carrying something heavy. If plans needed organizing, I did it. If emotions needed smoothing, I handled it quietly. If someone forgot an important date, I remembered it for them, without keeping score. In my marriage, this role settled onto me so gradually that I didn't notice when it became permanent. My husband would introduce me as the practical one, smiling as if that were a compliment. Friends joked that I was low maintenance. Family members said I was strong, the way people do when they don't intend to help you. I didn't protest, partly because I believed them, partly because being needed felt safer than being seen. At gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks, checking on elderly relatives, and making sure conversations didn't turn sharp. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, it was measured, designed to move things forward, not disrupt them. People trusted me with logistics, not with their curiosity. No one asked what I needed because I rarely appeared to need anything. My husband benefited from this more than anyone. I managed our shared calendar. I handled long-term planning. I absorbed stress so it wouldn't reach him in an inconvenient form. If he was tired, I adjusted. If he was distracted, I waited. If something disappointed me, I reframed it before it could become a problem. From the outside, we looked balanced, calm, functional. But balance can be deceptive when one person is doing most of the stabilizing. What's difficult to explain is that none of this felt like a sacrifice at first. It felt like adulthood, like a partnership, like maturity. I told myself that relationships weren't about keeping score, that love meant flexibility, that not everything required acknowledgement. And so, over time, I became predictable in the most dangerous way. People knew I wouldn't make scenes. They knew I'd adjust my expectations. They knew I would understand. That word followed me everywhere. You'll understand, as if my empathy were an unlimited resource instead of a human capacity with edges. In my marriage, I was understood as capable, but not fragile, useful, but not in need of protection, present, but interchangeable. My emotional world existed, but it wasn't treated as urgent. I didn't see myself as invisible. I saw myself as efficient. That distinction matters because invisibility rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed as appreciation without curiosity, as trust without attunement, as praise that never turns into care. When something hurt me, I processed it privately. When something disappointed me, I contextualized it. I had a well-practiced internal voice that said, "It's not that bad. He didn't mean it. This isn't the moment." Over time, those moments never came. My husband didn't dismiss me openly. He simply assumed my resilience. And I let him, because I had been doing the same. I had learned, long before marriage, that being emotionally low maintenance made life smoother, that asking for too much created tension, that grief, discomfort, or need should be handled discreetly, preferably alone. So when people describe me from that time, they use words like calm, capable, and grounded. They don't mention loneliness. They don't mention how often I sat with feelings that never became conversations. And that's the version of me who entered the season when my father died. The woman everyone trusted to be fine. The woman no one checked on twice. The woman whose silence had been misinterpreted for so long that, when she finally needed support, it didn't register as necessary. That is who I was to them. And understanding that version of myself is essential, because the story that follows isn't about sudden change. It's about what happens when someone who has always been easy to rely on finally notices the cost of that reliability. The first moment I remember clearly didn't look important at the time. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. It wasn't about my father's death. It happened earlier, months before, during an ordinary week when life was still moving forward as usual. I had just found out that my father's health was deteriorating faster than expected. Not an emergency yet, but no longer theoretical. The kind of news that doesn't stop your day, but quietly leans against it. I told my husband in the kitchen while he was scrolling on his phone. I kept my voice steady, factual. I didn't ask for anything. I rarely did. He nodded, still looking at the screen, and said, "That's rough." Then he added, "Let me know if you need to fly out or something. We'll figure it out." It sounded supportive enough. Anyone listening would have approved. But what I remember is what didn't happen. He didn't ask how I was handling it. He didn't look up. He didn't ask when I'd last spoken to my father or whether I was scared. The conversation ended as soon as it began, absorbed into the background noise of daily life. At the time, I told myself it made sense. He was busy. There wasn't anything to do yet. I didn't need comforting. I wasn't falling apart. That familiar internal voice went to work immediately, sanding down the edge of disappointment until it felt smooth enough to ignore. That was the first small cut. Not cruelty, not neglect in a dramatic sense, just an absence that landed and stayed. In the weeks that followed, my father's condition became part of my private mental landscape. I checked my phone more often. I coordinated calls with my siblings. I did research late at night, quietly so I wouldn't wake my husband. None of this was hidden. It just wasn't shared in a way that demanded attention. Occasionally, I would mention an update. Each time, my husband responded with the same general tone, sympathetic, brief, and emotionally distant. He trusted that I was managing it. And because I always had before, he assumed I always would. No one else seemed to notice either. Friends would ask, "How's work?" Before, "How's your family?" Conversations flowed around the subject, not toward it. I became skilled at carrying something heavy without letting it alter the room. What struck me later was how alone I felt without feeling abandoned. That's an important distinction. Abandonment is loud. This was quiet, polite, easy to rationalize. The cut didn't bleed. It didn't force a reaction. It simply marked something. There was a moment, small enough that I almost forgot it now, when I considered saying more. When I thought about telling my husband that I was scared, that I didn't want to navigate this alone, that I needed him to be more present, even if nothing practical was required yet. But the thought passed. I didn't want to burden him. I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to make something about me when nothing irreversible had happened. So I stayed in my role. I handled logistics. I absorbed uncertainty. I told myself that emotional support didn't always look like questions or conversations, that sometimes it looked like trust, that maybe his calm distance was his way of giving me space. Looking back, I can see that this is how patterns protect themselves. Everyone else ignored that moment because it was easy to ignore. There was no scene, no argument, no reason to intervene or remember it. But I remembered it, not as a grievance, but as data. I didn't write it down. I didn't bring it up later. I didn't attach meaning to it beyond a vague sense of disappointment that I assumed was my responsibility to manage. Still, something shifted quietly inside me. I began to notice the difference between being supported and being left alone politely, between someone trusting your strength and someone relying on it so they don't have to engage. At the time, I didn't confront it. I didn't change my behavior. I simply stored the information. And that's how the first small cut works. It teaches you what to expect without announcing that it's teaching you anything at all. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. And because nothing changed, I assumed nothing needed to. That's how normalization begins. My father's health continued its slow decline, and my awareness of it lived mostly in my body rather than my conversations. I carried a low-grade tension everywhere, like background noise you only notice when it stops. I slept lightly. I checked my phone before bed and the moment I woke up. I rehearsed difficult futures silently, as if preparation might soften them. My husband noticed none of this, or perhaps he noticed and trusted that I had it under control. The result was the same. When I mentioned upcoming trips to see my father, the conversation focused on logistics. Dates, flights, whether it conflicted with work obligations or social plans. He would ask practical questions, which I answered efficiently. It felt like teamwork, as long as you didn't look too closely at what was missing. What was missing was curiosity. No one asked what those visits cost me emotionally. No one asked how it felt to watch a parent weaken. No one asked whether I was afraid of what was coming. And slowly I stopped expecting anyone to. This is the part that's hardest to explain without sounding like I'm blaming others for my silence. Because I wasn't silenced. I was self-regulating. I was choosing not to speak because experience had taught me that speaking wouldn't change much. It might even create inconvenience. So I adjusted my expectations instead. I told myself that not everyone expresses care through words. My husband showed love by maintaining stability. My role in the relationship was to manage emotional complexity so it didn't spill into our shared life. Each time I did this, the bar lowered slightly. If he forgot to ask about my father for weeks at a time, I told myself it was because there was nothing new to report. If he scheduled work trips during periods when I was planning to travel to see my family, I told myself that independence was healthy. If he responded to updates with brief reassurances instead of engagement, I told myself that was his personality. Rationalization is a quiet skill. You don't even realize you're practicing it until it becomes fluent. Friends mirrored this dynamic. They assumed I was handling things. They didn't press. When I said, "It's okay, we're managing," they accepted it gratefully and moved on. No one wants to sit with unresolved grief if they don't have to. So I became easier to be around by making my pain less visible. What I didn't realize at the time was that this invisibility wasn't neutral. It was teaching the people around me how little presence was required. Disrespect doesn't always look like dismissal. Sometimes it looks like being consistently deprioritized without objection. Like your inner world becoming optional because you never insist otherwise. There were moments when I noticed this clearly. Small flashes of awareness that I quickly dimmed. Like the time my husband complained about a stressful week at work while I was coordinating hospice information on my lunch break, or the time he asked me to reschedule a visit to my father because it conflicted with a dinner he didn't want to attend alone. I said yes, of course I did. I told myself that compromise was part of marriage, that this wasn't the moment to make things heavy, that my father would understand. Each yes cost me something, but the cost was spread out enough that it didn't feel catastrophic, just cumulative. By the time my father's condition became critical, this pattern was deeply established. I had become someone whose emotional needs were negotiable because I had never framed them as non-negotiable. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with clarity, because it wasn't that my husband suddenly failed me when it mattered most. It was that we had quietly rehearsed that failure for months without naming it, and I had participated. That's the uncomfortable truth of normalization. It doesn't require malice. It only requires repetition and silence. When you normalize being dismissed, people stop questioning whether dismissal is occurring. It becomes the baseline, the expected rhythm. By the time I realized something was wrong, it didn't feel like a violation anymore. It felt like a fact of the relationship, and facts are harder to argue with than offenses. So I stayed calm. I stayed reasonable. I stayed quiet. And in doing so, I taught everyone, including myself, that my grief could wait. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being treated a certain way. I was being relied on to stay that way. The role had already been written. I had simply learned the lines well enough that no one questioned the casting. In my marriage, I was the one who absorbed inconvenience, so life could continue smoothly. If something needed to be postponed, adjusted, or quietly endured, it fell to me. Not because my husband demanded it outright, but because the system worked better when I did. I was dependable, flexible, emotionally self-contained. And because I rarely expressed distress in a way that disrupted anything, distress stopped registering as something that required response. That's when I began to see the role clearly, not in a dramatic revelation, but in a series of small realizations that stacked on top of each other. I noticed how decisions were made, not maliciously but efficiently. Work obligations, social commitments, personal preferences. These were discussed openly when they belonged to him. When they belonged to me, they were often treated as adjustable variables. I noticed how support was framed. If I needed time away, it was something to fit in. If he needed time away, it was something to protect. If I was overwhelmed, it was a phase. If he was overwhelmed, it was a problem to solve. No one ever said this out loud. That's what made it hard to name. But roles don't need to be spoken to be enforced. They're reinforced through expectation. My role was to be reliable enough that my absence would be inconvenient, but my pain would not. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I thought back over years of moments I had brushed past. Times when I had minimized my own needs to maintain harmony. Times when I had accepted emotional distance because confronting it felt unnecessary, or worse, selfish. I had been proud of my composure, proud of being the one who didn't overreact, proud of being easy. What I hadn't considered was how that pride made me predictable. When my father's health worsened significantly, the role activated automatically. I handled the phone calls, I coordinated with my siblings. I took time off work and rearranged responsibilities with practiced efficiency. My husband supported this in theory. He told people I was handling a lot right now. He expressed admiration for my strength. But admiration is not the same as presence. He didn't step into the emotional labor with me. He didn't ask how to help beyond logistics. He didn't offer to carry any part of the weight, unless asked directly. And by then, asking felt like breaking character. I was the strong one, the organizer, the one who would tell him what was needed, if anything was needed at all. So when nothing was asked, nothing was offered. That's the unspoken agreement roles create. I remember sitting alone one evening, paperwork spread out in front of me, realizing that if I disappeared emotionally, the system would still function. People would adjust. They always had. That realization wasn't dramatic, it was sobering, because it meant that my value had become tied to my utility, not my presence. And utility, once assumed, is rarely protected. I didn't confront my husband about this, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation felt misaligned. This wasn't about a single behavior that could be corrected with a conversation. This was about a structure we had both participated in building. I had trained him, unintentionally, to believe that I would manage my own pain, that I didn't require much, that my resilience was permanent. He had accepted that training gladly, because it made his life easier. Neither of us had stopped to ask what it was costing me. By the time I fully understood the role I had been assigned, my father was nearing the end of his life. The stakes were higher, time was thinner, and the margin for misunderstanding was gone. I was still playing the role, but something in me had already stepped back from it, quietly observing. And once you see the role clearly, you begin to understand exactly what will happen if you ever refuse to perform it. The day something shifted didn't arrive with an argument or a revelation spoken out loud. It came in a moment so quiet that, if I hadn't been paying attention to myself, I might have missed it entirely. It was the morning I got the call that my father had been moved into end-of-life care. I was standing by the window when my phone rang. The light outside was gray and steady, the kind that makes time feel suspended. I listened as my sister spoke, her voice controlled but thin, and I understood immediately what she was saying without needing all the details. There was nothing left to plan for, only time to be present. I thanked her, hung up, and stood there longer than necessary. I wasn't crying yet. I wasn't panicking. I was absorbing the fact that something irreversible had begun. When I told my husband, I did it the same way I always did, calmly, efficiently, without theatrics. I said my father was near the end. I would need to travel soon. Those things might move quickly. He listened. He put his phone down this time. He said he was sorry. He asked about flights. And then he went to work. Not in a cruel way. Not dismissively, just normally. That was the moment. Not because he should have known exactly what to do. Not because there's a perfect response to news like that. But because something inside me noticed how completely alone I still was in it. There was no pause in the day. No space was created around the gravity of what was happening. No sense that our shared life needed to bend to accommodate this loss. I sat down at the kitchen table after he left and realized I had reached the end of my ability to rationalize. For the first time, I didn't explain his behavior to myself. I didn't contextualize it. I didn't soften it. I just observed it. And in that observation, something shifted from endurance to clarity. I saw how much emotional labor I had been doing alone. How often I had told myself that needing more was unreasonable. How easily my grief fit into the margins of our life, because I had always made it fit. I didn't feel angry. I felt still. That stillness was new. In the days that followed, I traveled to see my father. I sat beside his bed. I held his hand. I listened to the rhythms of a body preparing to stop. All of my focus went there. My husband checked in occasionally. Texts, short calls, updates are exchanged efficiently. He asked when I'd be back. He did not come. At no point did he say he couldn't. He didn't frame it as impossible. It simply wasn't something he considered necessary. And for the first time, I didn't fill in the gap for him. I didn't reassure him that it was fine. I didn't tell him I understood. I didn't explain how hard it was or what I needed. I just let the absence exist. While sitting in that hospital room, watching my father's breathing slow, I understood something with absolute certainty. Support during grief is not about words or intentions. It is about presence. You remember who stands next to you when you are reduced to your most vulnerable self. Not because you want to keep score, but because your nervous system records it permanently. My father died early one morning quietly. I was there. My siblings were there. My husband was not. In the immediate aftermath, I functioned on autopilot. There were calls to make, arrangements to coordinate, details that needed attention. I did what I had always done, handled things. But inside, the shift had completed. I no longer wondered whether my expectations were too high. I no longer questioned whether I was asking for too much. I no longer debated whether this was just how he was. I knew exactly what I had witnessed, and I knew that I would never unknow it. Grief didn't make me reactive, it made me precise. It stripped away the stories I had been telling myself and left me with facts. And one of those facts was this. When I needed someone to show up without being asked, the person I had built my life with did not. I didn't confront him, not then. I didn't change my tone. I didn't announce a decision. I simply stopped carrying illusions. And from that moment on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It became something I chose. After my father's funeral, people expected me to fall apart, or to return to normal. They understood those two shapes of grief. What they didn't notice was the third one, stillness. I came back home quieter than before, but not in a fragile way, in a contained way. My husband interpreted this as resilience. He told friends I was doing okay, all things considered. He admired how composed I was. He didn't realize that my silence was no longer protective. It was deliberate. I stopped explaining myself, not in an obvious way. I still answered questions. I still handled responsibilities, but I no longer filled emotional gaps for other people. If my husband didn't ask how I was, I didn't volunteer. If he didn't inquire about my father, I didn't bring him up. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I had learned something in grief, that presence offered only when requested is not the same as presence freely given. And I was no longer interested in teaching anyone how to care for me. My husband mistook this shift for strength. He told me he admired how self-sufficient I was. He didn't hear the finality underneath that word. Silence, when chosen, has a different texture. It's observant. It gathers information. It doesn't rush to resolve discomfort. I noticed how rarely my husband checked in unless something disrupted his routine. I noticed how quickly he returned to normal once the immediate logistics of death had passed. I noticed how he spoke about the funeral, briefly, abstractly, as something that was now over. For me, nothing was over. It had simply been archived in a place that could not be revisited. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I became exact. I responded appropriately and no more. I matched energy instead of compensating for its absence. I stopped preemptively managing emotions that weren't mine. This made things smoother, not harder, which is how I knew the imbalance had been real. When you stop overfunctioning, systems reveal themselves. My husband became more relaxed, not less. He assumed things were fine because there was no conflict. He didn't realize that conflict had never been my method of communication. I had moved into a phase of internal recalibration. In that recalibration, I began to ask myself questions I had avoided for years. What does partnership look like in grief? What kind of support do I consider non-negotiable? What happens if I stop making myself endlessly adaptable? I didn't ask these questions out loud. I didn't need a consensus. I needed clarity. Silence gave me that. I found myself remembering moments from the past with new context. Not just with my husband, but with others. Times when I had shown up unquestioningly. Times when my presence had been assumed rather than valued. I didn't feel angry about these memories. I felt informed. There's a difference. Anger seeks release. Information seeks application. I began to take notes. Not literal ones, but mental ones. I observed patterns. Who reached out without prompting? Who avoided discomfort? Who offered help only when it was easy? My husband fell into the middle category. Not malicious, not cruel, but deeply accustomed to a version of me that required nothing from him emotionally. And now that version was gone. He didn't notice immediately. That's the thing about quiet shifts. They don't trigger alarms. They just change the foundation. I still loved him in a way, but it was no longer unquestioning. It was conditional on reality, not hope. When people say silence is passive, they misunderstand it. Silence can be a decision not to negotiate with what you already know. I wasn't waiting for him to change. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't setting traps. I was preparing myself for whatever clarity would require. And clarity, once earned, doesn't ask for permission. What no one noticed, least of all my husband, was that my quiet had direction. From the outside, nothing had changed. I still went to work. I still participated in conversations. I still handled shared responsibilities with the same efficiency as before. If anything, I seemed more composed. But beneath that surface, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. Grief stripped my life down to essentials. It taught me how little energy I had for performance. And with that clarity came an unexpected gift, focus. I began to notice patterns, not just in behavior, but in structure. How our finances were arranged, how decisions were made, how much of our shared life depended on assumptions that had never been examined. This wasn't about plotting, it was about understanding. I realized, for example, that I had been the primary manager of our long-term planning without ever being recognized as such. I knew where every account was, how every bill was paid, what every contingency looked like. I had handled these things quietly because it felt efficient. Now I looked at them differently. I asked myself, if I needed to stand alone tomorrow, what would that require? Not emotionally, practically. I reviewed documents, I organized records. I made sure I understood every shared obligation and every individual one. I didn't hide this. I simply didn't announce it. There was no reason to. My husband assumed things were continuing as they always had. He trusted my competence without wondering what it enabled. I also began to pay attention to conversations. Not just what was said, but what was avoided. When my father's name came up, my husband grew uncomfortable. He would redirect gently, as if grief were a topic best kept contained. I let him. I noticed how rarely he asked questions that didn't have immediate utility. His concern tended to activate only when a problem intersected with his experience. This information didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. I started to invest my energy differently. Less into smoothing over dynamics, more into strengthening myself. I took on projects at work that expanded my autonomy. I reconnected with colleagues who respected my competence without requiring emotional diminishment. I built a life that didn't rely on being understood. This wasn't isolation, it was positioning. I also noticed something else. People reveal their assumptions when you stop reinforcing them. Friends who had relied on me for emotional availability without reciprocation drifted slightly. Others leaned in, surprised by the depth of what I hadn't been sharing. I didn't chase either response. My husband remained steady in his belief that things were fine. He enjoyed the calm. He liked that I wasn't emotional. He didn't see that my emotional energy had simply been reallocated. What he never noticed was how carefully I was documenting, not just finances, but moments. Who showed up, who didn't, who asked questions without being prompted, who avoided discomfort. This wasn't resentment, it was discernment. I had learned in grief that memory is not something you control. Your body remembers who made space for you when you were raw. And once that memory is formed, it becomes part of your decision-making, whether you want it to or not. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't hint at change. I didn't issue ultimatums. I let the reality speak for itself. There's a misconception that power looks like assertion. Sometimes it looks like preparation, like making sure you understand your environment before deciding how to move through it. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic moment. I was creating conditions. And the more grounded I became, the clearer it was that the life I had been living required me to stay small in very specific ways. Ways I was no longer willing to accept. Still, nothing external had happened yet. No confrontation, no visible shift in status. No one felt threatened. That's why they didn't notice. They assumed the quiet meant stability. They didn't realize it meant readiness. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no surge of triumph, no moment where I sat back and thought, now I have it. It came quietly, the way real clarity usually does. I was sitting alone one evening, documents spread across the table, not because I was searching for anything specific, but because I had made it a habit to understand my own life thoroughly. I was reviewing our shared financial structure, something I had managed for years without ever framing it as power. That night, I saw it differently. What I realized wasn't a loophole or a secret. It was something much simpler and more sobering. I understood fully and unmistakably how much of our stability relied on my unseen labor, my consistency, my restraint, and my willingness to smooth over imbalance. Not just emotionally, but practically. I saw how exposed he was to systems he barely understood because he had never needed to. How protected he had been by my competence. How much trust he had placed in my reliability without ever asking what sustained it. The leverage wasn't something I could use. That word feels too aggressive, too intentional. It was something I could withdraw. And the most important part of that realization was this. Withdrawing, it would not look like punishment. It would look like an absence, like neutrality, like stepping out of a role rather than tearing it down. There was no satisfaction in this discovery, only calm. Because leverage gained through anger is unstable. Leverage gained through understanding is clean. I didn't tell anyone. Not a friend, not a sibling, certainly not my husband. There was nothing to announce, nothing to explain. This wasn't a threat, it was information. And information, once internalized, changes how you stand in a room. I began to see how often I had been compensating, not just for my husband, but for the entire structure of our shared life. How often I had bridged gaps that were not mine to bridge. How often I had translated silence into safety for others at my own expense. Knowing I could stop doing that without raising my voice, without justifying myself, without drama, was sobering. Because it meant the imbalance wasn't accidental. It was functional. And it functioned because I made it so. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Responsible for deciding whether I was willing to continue maintaining a system that had failed me at the moment it mattered most. I thought about my father then, about the simplicity of that hospital room, about how nothing in that space was theoretical. Presence had either been there or it hadn't. That memory cut through any temptation to rationalize. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about evening the score. It was about alignment between what I knew and how I lived. Once you see that alignment clearly, you can't unknow it. I slept well that night, not because I was relieved, but because my body recognized that I was no longer confused. From that point on, I moved differently, subtly but decisively. I no longer made choices based on preserving comfort at all costs. I made them based on sustainability. And sustainability requires reciprocity. My husband still didn't notice. He mistook my calm for continuity. He assumed that because nothing was being demanded, nothing was changing. He didn't understand that the most significant shifts don't announce themselves. They settle, and once they settle, they don't reverse. Clarity eventually demands a response, not immediately and not theatrically, but inevitably. For a long time, I existed in a space where no decision was required. I understood the imbalance. I understood my leverage, but understanding alone doesn't force action. It simply removes excuses. The decision point arrived not as a crisis, but as a convergence. It came during an ordinary evening, months after my father's death. My husband was talking about a future plan. Something minor, something assumed. A vacation schedule, a long-term commitment made casually, as if the framework of our lives was still unquestioned. He spoke with confidence because he had never had to doubt it. As he talked, I realized something with absolute calm. He was making plans that required a version of me I no longer inhabited. Not because I was broken, because I was informed. In that moment, several paths were available to me. I could confront him emotionally, explain how deeply he had hurt me by not showing up, ask for accountability, hope that remorse would lead to change. I could continue as we were, accept the trade-off, maintain stability, preserve appearances, live with the quiet cost. Or I could choose the option that required no persuasion at all, the irreversible one. I didn't decide in that moment. I had already decided internally. That conversation simply made it undeniable. The irreversible choice wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reactive. It didn't involve punishment. It involved withdrawal of participation from a system that no longer met my minimum standards of partnership. And the reason it was irreversible was simple. Once you stop believing someone will show up for you when it matters, you cannot rebuild that belief through explanation alone. Trust and grief is binary. Presence either happened or it didn't. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't frame it as an ultimatum. I didn't need to. I chose preparation over persuasion. That night, after he went to bed, I sat quietly and outlined what disengagement would look like in practical terms. Not emotionally, logistically. What steps would be required to ensure autonomy? What timelines were realistic? What boundaries would need to be held? There was no panic in this planning, no fear, just sequence. The absence of emotional volatility surprised me. I had expected grief to make me fragile. Instead, it had made me exact. I realized that asking him to change would require me to explain my pain in a language he had never shown fluency in. And even if he listened, even if he tried, the memory of absence would remain. I didn't want performance. I wanted reality. So I chose the path that didn't require convincing someone to care in a way they hadn't chosen freely. This wasn't about whether he was a bad person. It was about whether he was the person I could trust to stand beside me when I was undone. He wasn't, and knowing that, I couldn't unknow it. The decision point isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet recognition that continuing requires more self-betrayal than leaving. I didn't feel brave. I felt aligned. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't negotiate. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. That surprised me most. I had expected urgency, maybe fear. Instead, what I felt was patience, measured, deliberate, and grounded. Moving in silence didn't mean hiding. It meant acting without narration. I began with what I could control. I separated my internal life from the shared one, not emotionally, structurally. I stopped assuming continuity. I started planning for independence with the same care I had once applied to maintaining the marriage. I reviewed legal documents carefully, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I consulted professionals quietly, asking questions without signaling intent. I learned what was already mine, what was shared, and what would need to be disentangled. At work, I made adjustments that looked like ambition from the outside. I positioned myself for flexibility. I strengthened my professional footing so no part of my life would depend on tolerance. No one questioned this. Growth rarely alarms people. At home, I became even more neutral. Calm, predictable, pleasant even. My husband interpreted this as peace. He thought we had made it through a hard season. He didn't realize I had stopped counting us as a unit. I no longer planned for we in the future tense. I planned for me, quietly, responsibly, without resentment. I didn't provoke conversations. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. I simply stopped overfunctioning. I let gaps remain where I had once filled them. He noticed none of this because nothing broke. That's the paradox of silent movement. When done well, it preserves surface stability while changing foundations entirely. There were moments when he sensed distance but dismissed it. After all, there were no fights, no accusations, no visible threats. From his perspective, the relationship was calm. From mine, it was complete. I remember thinking how much easier this would have been if there had been yelling, if there had been something obvious to point to. But grief had taught me that clarity doesn't need witnesses. Each step I took reduced my dependence, not on him emotionally, but on the structure that had required my silence. I grieved during this period, but not for the marriage. That grief had already happened. I grieved the version of myself who believed endurance would be met with reciprocity, and then I let her go. What I didn't do was seek validation. I didn't need agreement. I needed completion. Moving in silence is not about secrecy. It's about refusing to negotiate with reality. It's about understanding that once you see the truth of something, explaining it to someone who benefited from not seeing it is optional. By the time I was ready to act openly, everything essential was already done. And that is why no one noticed, until they did. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They begin as subtle absences, small disruptions that feel inconvenient rather than alarming. That's how it started. My husband noticed first in practical ways. Things he had never worried about before required his attention. Deadlines need tracking. Decisions need follow-up. Emotional labor he had never named suddenly had no one managing it quietly in the background. He didn't connect these changes to me. He thought he was just stressed. I watched this with detachment, not satisfaction. This wasn't about watching him struggle. It was about observing what happened when I stopped compensating. At home, the rhythm changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. I was still present, but less anticipatory. I no longer preempted needs. I responded instead of initiating. He began to feel something he couldn't name: disorientation. People are rarely aware of how much support they receive when it's consistent. They only notice when it's gone. He asked occasionally if something was wrong. I said no, and it was true. Nothing was wrong. Things were simply no longer arranged for his comfort. At work, my increased focus and autonomy paid off. I was recognized for leadership, which I had always practiced quietly. Opportunities emerged not because of luck, but because I was no longer diverting energy elsewhere. The contrast was striking. While my personal life became quieter and more contained, my professional life expanded. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of alignment. Friends noticed I was different, calmer, more self-possessed. They assumed grief had matured me. They weren't wrong. My husband, however, began to sense loss without understanding its cause. He felt less central, less buffered. He missed the ease of our previous dynamic, but couldn't articulate what had changed. And because there had been no confrontation, he had nothing to defend against. This is the part people misunderstand. Consequences don't always come from action. Sometimes they come from inaction, from the withdrawal of something that was never guaranteed. I didn't explain. Explanation would have reframed this as a negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. The life we had built depended on my quiet participation. Without it, the structure remained standing, but it creaked. And that creaking was new to him. He began to express vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something was off. He suggested we reconnect. I listened politely. But reconnection requires a shared reality, and ours had already diverged. The consequences were not punishment. They were exposed. Exposure of imbalance. Exposure of assumptions. Exposure of how much he had relied on a version of me that no longer existed. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Because by then, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was unfolding exactly as expected. And when consequences arrive quietly, they are harder to argue with. By the time my husband realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. That's the part people struggle with the most. They assume there is always a moment where effort can still change the outcome. A point where apologies, awareness, or urgency can rewind damage. But some losses don't come from a single failure. They come from accumulated absence. And absence, once internalized, doesn't respond to panic. He started trying in ways that would have mattered before. He asked more questions. He suggested counseling. He referenced my father, awkwardly, carefully, as if naming the loss might bridge the distance. He expressed confusion about why I felt so far away when, in his words, nothing bad is happening now. That sentence told me everything. To him, the crisis had passed. The funeral was over. Time had moved on. He believed we were addressing a lingering mood, not a foundational break. What he didn't understand was that grief is not a phase you return from unchanged. It reorganizes your sense of safety. And safety, once lost, is not restored by effort alone. I listened to him without interrupting. I didn't argue. I didn't correct his framing. I let him speak because I wasn't trying to be understood anymore. He was trying to fix something he still didn't fully see. There was panic under his composure now. Not loud, but unmistakable. He could feel control slipping. The ease he had relied on was gone, and he didn't know why. He asked me what I needed. That question would have meant everything once. Now, it landed as a formality. Because when you have to explain what presence should have looked like during the most vulnerable moment of your life, the explanation itself becomes proof that it's too late. I didn't want better behavior. I wanted the memory of being supported when I was undone. And that is not something anyone can recreate after the fact. You can't retroactively stand beside someone in grief. I could see him trying to assess the seriousness of the moment. But he was approaching it intellectually, not emotionally. He was problem-solving, not remembering. And grief is remembered in the body, not the mind. I didn't feel anger toward him in those conversations. I felt distance. A clean, quiet distance that no longer needed justification. He asked if I still loved him. I told him the truth. That love was not the issue. Trust was. And trust, once broken by absence, does not respond to intensity. It responds to history. Our history had already answered. He wanted reassurance. He wanted timelines. He wanted to know what to do next. I gave him none of those things. Not because I wanted to withhold, but because I no longer had anything to offer that would change the outcome. It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty without negotiation. By the time he was ready to show up fully, I had already learned how to stand alone. And once that knowledge settles into your bones, it doesn't leave. People often say, at least he's trying now. But effort after the fact doesn't undo the moment when effort was absent. And that was the moment my body remembered most clearly. By the end of that period, his confusion had turned into regret. Regret turned into pleading. Pleading turned into silence. Not mine, his. And in that silence, the truth finally became unavoidable. The time to be present had passed. Some choices are remembered not because they were dramatic, but because they were final. When the confrontation finally happened, it didn't resemble what most people imagine. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown like weapons. No list of grievances was delivered with shaking hands. It happened on a quiet evening, after dinner, when the house was still, and there was nowhere else for the truth to hide. My husband asked me, carefully this time, if we could talk. Not because he wanted to fix something, but because he sensed that something irreversible had already occurred. I agreed. We sat across from each other, and I let him speak first. He talked about confusion, about distance, about feeling like he had missed something important without realizing it was happening. He said he felt like he was being punished without knowing the crime. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I didn't respond immediately, not to create tension, but because I wanted to be precise. Then I told him the truth, calmly, without embellishment. I said that when my father was dying, I had needed presence, not logistics. That I had needed someone to stand beside me without being asked. That I had noticed who did and who didn't. I told him that his absence during that time had changed something in me permanently. Not because he was cruel, but because he was comfortable. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize, I didn't raise my voice. I stated facts. He tried to explain. He said he didn't realize how much I needed him. That he thought I was handling it. That he would do things differently now. I told him I believed that. And then I told him it didn't change anything. That was the moment the room shifted. Not because of what I said, but because of how little emotion I attached to it. I explained that I no longer measured partnership by intentions or improvement. I measured it by the presence when it was inconvenient, when it required discomfort, when it couldn't be scheduled or optimized. I said that grief had clarified my non-negotiables, and that one of them was not having to ask for support when I was undone. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him no, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because the work he needed to do was internal. The result would not be me. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was a consequence. I told him that I wasn't angry, that I didn't hate him, that I simply no longer trusted him with my vulnerability. And vulnerability, once withheld, changes the shape of everything else. The conversation ended quietly. There was sadness. There was shock. There was a kind of grief on his side that mirrored mine. But much later, I didn't comfort him, not out of cruelty, but because comforting him would have required me to step back into the role I had already left. We didn't argue after that. There was nothing left to argue about. Some confrontations don't escalate, they conclude, and that one did. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was before. I didn't become hardened or closed or suspicious of love. I became precise. After everything ended, there was a quiet period where nothing dramatic happened. No collapse, no sudden freedom that felt euphoric. Just space. Clean, unfamiliar space where I could finally hear myself think without adjusting the volume for anyone else. Grief doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It integrates. It settles into you and alters how you interpret the world. What changed most was not my behavior, but my internal standards. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I no longer believe that being easy is a sign of emotional maturity. I no longer assume that my silence will be interpreted with care. I understand now that presence is a choice people make, not a trait they discover when prompted. I still love deeply. I still show up for people, but I no longer overfunction to make relationships work. I don't compensate for emotional absence. I don't translate neglect into personality differences, and I don't stay where my grief would be inconvenient. I carry my father with me differently now, not as a wound, but as a reference point. He taught me many things in life, but his death taught me the clearest one. Time reveals priorities with ruthless honesty. The people who stood beside me during that loss earned permanent access to my inner life. The ones who didn't are villains, but they no longer get the same closeness. This boundary doesn't require explanation. I am quieter now, but not smaller. My silence isn't emptiness, it's discernment. I've learned that power doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being able to walk away without resentment when something no longer aligns. And alignment is not negotiable. I don't regret loving fully. I don't regret trying. What I regret, if anything, is how long it took me to realize that my needs were not excessive. They were simply unmet. Who I am now is someone who trusts her memory, someone who believes her body when it records absence, someone who understands that some choices, especially the quiet ones, echo forever. I am no longer invisible, but even if I were, I would still be present to myself, and that has made all the difference. There's a lesson in this story, but it isn't the kind that fits neatly into advice or blame. It's quieter than that. We like to believe that love is proven in grand gestures, in words spoken at the right time, in apologies, in growth after conflict. But the truth is simpler and harder to accept. Support is remembered most in grief. Not because we want to judge people, not because we want to punish them, but because grief strips us down to our most unguarded state. And in that state, our bodies remember who stood beside us without being asked. You don't forget the absence in those moments. You don't argue with it. You don't explain it away. You carry it forward, whether you intend to or not. This story isn't about my husband being a villain. He wasn't. It's about what happens when comfort replaces presence, when reliability is mistaken for invulnerability, and when silence is interpreted as consent. It's also about responsibility, not his alone, but mine. I stayed quiet for too long. I normalized what hurt me because it didn't look dramatic. I believed that endurance was a form of love. It isn't. Endurance without reciprocity is erosion. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this. You don't need to justify why a moment mattered to you. If someone wasn't there when you were undone, that information is enough. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the clarity grief gives you. And if you are the person listening to this and recognizing yourself in the absence, if you realize you didn't show up when someone needed you, this isn't condemnation. It's an invitation. Presence is a choice. It always has been. You don't get to redo the moment, but you do get to learn from it. I'm sharing this story not to be admired and not to be pitied, but to name something many people feel and struggle to articulate. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment, about choosing not to negotiate with what you already know. Thank you for listening patiently. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to ask you one question, and I'll read your answers in the comments. When you look back on your hardest moment, who do you remember being there with you? And what did their presence teach you about what you deserve?